we jump in, because we have a relatively small group here, again, it's all about quality, not quantity. I wondered if we could we go around quickly and just, if you could let me know who you're with and maybe your role in your respective organization, that would be great. Love to just put faces with names, if you don't mind. And maybe Diane, could I start with you?
Sure, Diane Nelson. I am a state director with Carrie Richard Viking Insurance here in Middletown.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Diane. And Kelly, can I go back to you?
Sure. Kelly Lee, Executive Director at Lucy's Hearth in Middletown.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. And Kyle, I believe you said you're with Ocean Point Financial. Is that right?
Yep, Ocean Point Insurance.
Yeah, Ocean Point Insurance. Got it. All right. Let me see. I know you, Judy, but do you mind mentioning?
Sure. Judy Bowen from Marsh & McLennan Agency on the employee benefits.
Awesome. Thank you, Jude. And Stacy, how about you?
Hi, Al. I'm Stacy Carter from Salve Regina. I run the Center for Business Outreach.
Awesome. Awesome. A big fan of Salve. Big fan of Salve. So we'll welcome everybody. Just a little tiny bit of background about me and our little firm here. Our organization is called High Performing Culture. We work with approximately 400 organizations all over the country, although I'm based here in little old Rhode Island, and I'm a Rhode Island guy. I went to URI, although I spent a year at Salve, so I have an affinity for the school.
URI too.
Excellent, excellent. And it's interesting. We work with an incredibly diverse range of organizations. We work with for-profit, not-for-profit. We work with high-tech. We work with low-tech, manufacturing, construction, you name it, we probably work with them. Universities, churches. I guess if the organization involves human beings, chances are pretty good we work with one within that industry sector. But the common denominator across all the organizations we work with is probably a lot like you. They have good leaders who understand how important their culture is. And what's also interesting with a lot of our clients, they were already good, if not really good, long before we got on the picture. They just wanted to get better. They hadn't realized that culture was something that we can be systematic about, or we like to use the term operationalize. You know, you can literally create an operating system to drive the kind of culture that you want to drive, whatever that might be and whatever it is you're looking for. So that's a little bit about us. I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint today, quick PowerPoint. I'm going to spend most of our time on the good news, on the positive stuff. I think we're all dealing with enough of the negative and the challenging. I want to address some of those things quickly, but very quickly pivot into the real positive, affirmative. All right, kind of what can we do about it? So I'm truly going to lay out a roadmap for you that defines the process we use. I'm not saying it's for everybody, but I will say it can have significant impact if it's a fit with your organization. At minimum, I hope to give you a couple ideas that you can take away and truly begin applying, like immediately, like today. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and go ahead and start the PowerPoint here. Slideshow, play from the start. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, awesome.
Yes.
Wonderful. Again, particularly since we have such a small group, don't be shy about jumping in, asking questions. Stop me if I'm going on too much and you need a break. Yeah, with that, let's go ahead and jump into this. And again, the points of emphasis here are You know, we're living in a time right now where there are far more questions than there are answers, right? You know, there are the obvious economic questions, a lot of which many of us are feeling and seeing and experience. You know, there's the questions around the workforce. Some of our folks are remote, some of us are in the office. Some of our business are being impacted in terms of how we deliver the products or services we deliver. How many customers can we have in our store? How do we deliver our products to them? So lots and lots of questions. Not to mention the more personal questions. I'll be fully transparent here. At any given time, you could hear a primal scream from upstairs, and it'll be my teenage daughters working remotely in high school when the Wi-Fi goes out. You know, we're all dealing with issues like this that we never had to deal with before. When will a vaccine be ready? What's going to happen in the election, and what's going to be the impact of that? So lots and lots of questions. This screen that I'm just showing you here is a recent, fresh off the press poll conducted by a combination of Wells Fargo and Gallup, where they just surveyed small business owners and just to kind of check their pulse. What are they feeling? The good news is there's a slight uptick in terms of how small businesses are feeling overall about things in general and the future. You know, the bad news is where even with that uptick, this is half the spot we were, prior to pandemic hitting. So again, bottom line, lots of questions. Someone might want to mute there. Sounds like there might be somebody in the room there. So let me go ahead and advance this. Oh, apologize, click off. There we go. All right. With that too, we have an evolving workplace. What our actual workplaces look like are continuing to change. So the big question is, and the reason why we're here this morning is, what can we do about it, right? We have all these questions, fewer answers. Some of the things that I believe we need to do in order to address this. We need to increase and enhance the level of predictability within our organizations, whatever they are. We as leaders, as well as our team members, are dealing with all those things I mentioned, right? Personally and professionally. The level of uncertainty is absolutely through the roof. So needless to say, what do they call it? The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The flight or fight's kicked in. We need to figure out ways, personally and organizationally, to settle things down, to anchor ourselves to things that will not only help us get through all of this, but help us to be better once we do get through this, which we will. We need to provide clarity. We need to be really, really clear on expectations with our team members, particularly in these times. If we have split workforces, our teams are at home and others are in the office, we need to be clear on what's expected while working from home or while in the office, what our service standards are. We need to create consistency in terms of how we do things, how we deliver the things we deliver, whether it be product or service. We need to establish crystal clear consistency around that. We also need to be doing what we can in terms of just easing general anxiety. And I believe having a process, having a consistent system will allow us to do that. It's like looking at meditation. When we can be intentional and reflect and have a process, it can bring the blood pressure down. And last but certainly not least is we need to be able to establish really clear and consistent communication like never before, which is challenging, right? Given the dynamics of everything we're dealing with. Again, remote team members, so on and so forth. We really need to be with that, even more cognizant of looking for ways to increase our communication with our team members. So now the real $1,000,000 question, how do we do that? I'd argue we do that by creating the rock solid of an extraordinary culture. I'm going to see if I can mute everybody for a second because someone seems to be on here. Let's see here. Can everyone else hear that in the background? Yeah.
Yes, I think there's one person who didn't mute.
Okay. Let me see. I can't see. Oh, there we go. All right. We got everybody muted. Sorry about that. All right. So when we look at the roadmap for building an extraordinary culture, this is what it looks like. This is what we call our 8-step framework for designing, building, and driving an extraordinary culture. And you can see the way this graph is organized. The two most critical components are in the core, or in the center of the graph, steps 1 and step 2. Steps 3 and 8 kind of surround it, all incredibly important, yet the core of our process really is designed around steps 1 and 2. So that's where we're going to be spending most of our time here this morning. And really starting with step 1. Because I'd argue it's incredibly challenging, if not altogether impossible, to do anything about our culture until and unless we've been really, really clear in defining what we want our culture to be. Our experience is that most organizations haven't been clear enough. Some have been better than others. Some organizations have done a nice job maybe of defining their mission and their values, but have stopped there. Whereas our clients take it a step further. Their level of clarity focuses on what are these specific behaviors that make us who we are and or who we want to be. You know, what are the great things we're doing now with each other as teammates and for those we serve. And let's make sure we capture those and codify those. And let's also identify those things that we need to get better at. In a way, it's like building a curriculum, because our process, when you boil it all down into its simplest terms and simplest form, is really a teaching process. And like any teaching process, you need a very specific curriculum in order to really have any impact or affect anything about it. And it starts there. And I'm going to come back to it in a second, but it really has to start there. Step 2, and I'm going to use this phrase, even though I really dislike it, but step 2 is the secret sauce in this process. Step 2 is what makes it work and what makes it last. And don't be frightened by the term ritualized, because there's no religious connotation. It's really just a word we use. It's really about creating habits. It's what prevents everything we define in step 1 from becoming like most initiatives, which are tend to be flavor of the month. New training programs unrolled with great fanfare, but 6 months in, we get bored and distracted and it falls apart. You can look at this on a personal level too. You know, you look at what used to happen back when we could go to the gym, when that used to happen. Look at what would happen every January 1st at every gym around the country. You know, they would get packed, but by Valentine's Day, they'd become empty again. Human nature is such that it's difficult to stick with things. We get bored, we just get distracted, a pandemic hits, something happens, life gets in the way. Rituals allow us to continue on regardless of what happens, so we don't have to rely on discipline or willpower. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute too. I'm intentionally leaving it a little bit vague, but those two steps in and of themselves, we find with our clients that get good at those first two steps, boy, get very far down the road with really beginning to effectively drive their culture. All right, I'm going to move pretty quickly now around steps 3 and 8. With that said, just jump in if you have a question or want me to stop or explain anything further. But step 3 in the process is making sure we are selecting and continue to select the right people for our team. And this is challenging, particularly in these days that we're working through, right? Finding the good talent is even more challenging than it was. But in step 3, it's making sure as we're doing so that the talent we're bringing into our organizations not only have the education, experience, training, but they're also a fit for what you've defined in step 1. So you can begin to see, unless we've defined what it is we're looking for in step 1, how can we begin to hire for it or manage to it? But it's having the discipline, even when we need a body. We have a client in state of Wisconsin, large grocery store chain. They used to have an approach with their hiring. They needed people behind the cash registers, right? They needed bodies. Yet they came to the realization that if they weren't a fit culturally, they would cause more harm to their stores than good. They would drive customers away. They would alienate their teammates. They could be toxic. So their approach now is to make sure that in addition to having, education, experience, what have you, they're also a fit culturally. And it's not to say you're going to bat 1,000, because you're still going to get those that interview well, answer your questions the right way, but your percentages will improve greatly if you can really tune in to making sure they're a fit with number 1 and asking great interview questions around what you've defined in step 1. Step 4 is making sure you have a process for how you bring people into your organization. Even if you're a small little 3, 4, 5, 6 employee shop or a several hundred employee organization, how you bring somebody in once hired is incredibly important. I like to think of it this way. I think the experience for our new employees should be the same type of experience we want to show a customer that walks into our shop or to who we serve or provide our services to. We want that same level of kindness, positivity, whatever it is that you're defining in step 1 as we bring people in, because we're creating a first impression. We're creating a first impression, which is really indicating what our organization is all about, what we stand for. So we need to have a process in place. Some companies, organizations will call this process onboarding or orientation. And whether you have currently a program or not, it's okay. If you do have a program currently, you want to make sure there's elements of what you're defining in step 1 as part of that process. I'll just take a quick break here, just check and see if there's any questions before I kind of quickly move on. Okay, let's keep going then. Step 5 in the process is communicating the language of what you define in step 1, both formally and informally. I'll give you examples. Informally would be just using the language in everyday conversation. For example, a common behavior defined by many of our clients is get clear on expectations. So an example of using that in everyday conversations might be, let's say Kyle asked me to run a proposal for him for one of his insurance clients. I say, hey, Kyle, I just want to be clear on expectations here. You need this by Tuesday at 5, correct? Notice how I'm actually literally using the language and communicating the language of what we define as being an important behavior for us. That's just one example. Other examples, we have clients that literally do have the language of what they've defined on the walls of their company, in conference rooms or in the reception area. So as customers come in or vendors come into their organization, it's literally scattered about. Now, I like to make an important distinction here, because many of you have probably seen, and this is not a knock on the product, but many of you have probably seen, and maybe some of you have had in the past, those successory prints where, you know, they show everyone in a rowboat and it says, you know, teamwork, but you know, what's going on in the picture is not what's going on at that organization. So we're not talking about that. So the behaviors need to match what it is we put on the walls, but having it on the walls and visible physically doesn't change behavior, but it will reinforce everything else we're doing to drive our culture. But it's just looking for ways to communicate it as frequently as we can. It will become automatic, but until we get to that point, we need a process. Number 6, outside of steps 1 and 2 are is the area that moves the needle more than any of these other steps. And that's making sure we're coaching our teammates and each other on what we've defined in step 1 as being really important. There are things going on in your respective organization right now. As we're on this call, there are things going on in your organization that are potential coaching and teaching opportunities for us. You know, you have some team members dealing with a customer or with someone to whom they provide service. You have a team member dealing with another team member on an issue, and maybe they're butting heads. So all those things are wonderful opportunities to coach and lead and teach on what's important. You know, for example, a lot of our clients, another common behavior is we honor our commitments. You know, we do what we say we're going to do. Maybe one of your team members is falling short. They were supposed to get an order out by Wednesday and they didn't. That represents a wonderful coaching opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with that team member and say, hey, you know, honoring our commitments is important to us as an organization. We fell short this time. How can we make it right? How can we do better? More importantly, how can we prevent it from happening again? We as leaders need to be tuned into those opportunities. Once we define what's expected, we need to be tuned into that and make sure we leverage those coaching opportunities. By the way, it's really not much different from coaching. If anyone has ever been involved in coaching youth sports, you know, I coached my daughter's youth basketball team for over 10 years. No different. When one of our girls was living to one of the behaviors we talked about, I made a big deal of it with the rest of the team. One of our behaviors was we hustle on every play. So if I saw one of my girls diving for a loose ball or, you know, really going above and beyond, I'd make a great big deal of it in front of the rest of the team. You know, look at Susie go. Did you see her dive for that ball? Whereas if I saw one of our girls falling short, for example, one of our behaviors was be a good sport. If I saw one of our team members get upset at a call that a referee made, or maybe she kicked the ball, I'd quietly take her aside and we'd have a private conversation. And I would just ask her, hey, Susie, what happened there? You know, we talk about being a good sport. You know, what went wrong? How can we do better next time? But it was up to me as a coach to leverage that opportunity to ultimately reinforce that behavior that we were looking for. 7 is very similar, although it's the unspoken word. It's leading by example. It's making sure we're aware that our team members are going to look to us as leaders of the organization. And whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, they're probably thinking in their minds, boy, if it's good enough for Kelly, it's good enough for me. It doesn't mean we need to be perfect, however, in everything we define or expect in step 1. But it does mean we need to be aware, and if we are lacking in an area or working on an area, you know, we have to freely admit that. Another example amongst our clients is a common behavior is the importance of listening generously or listen to understand. Yet I work with a lot of business leaders that just aren't very good listeners. They're too busy. Their minds are all over the place. So it's difficult for them to settle, be quiet, and just take in the information. Yet with those same leaders, it can be very, very powerful when they admit that to their team members and say, hey, Joe, I know we talk about listening as a company. Heaven knows I need to get a lot better at it, but I'm working on it. In fact, I need your help to help me become a better listener because it's that important a skill. And last but not least, in these 8 steps, before we dive in a little bit more to 1 and 2, is we need to drive accountability. We need to hold each other and our team members accountable to what we define as being important in step 1. Because if we're not holding each other accountable, the process doesn't work. If there's no line in the sand that we're willing to draw, the process won't work. So we kind of have to ask ourselves, how important is this? There's a popular quote, and I'm unsure who said it, but I agree with it. And that quote is, the true definition of your culture is actually the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. In other words, if someone was kind of viewing what went on in your organization and they didn't know anything about you or how you did things, but just watched and listened, they would define your culture as the worst behavior they saw going on there. That where people weren't held accountable to living to what you define as being important. Therefore, it becomes critical to draw the line in the sand. And there's lots of ways of doing that, right? Informally, it's just having conversations, quarterly checkups, but it's also making sure more formally that what you define in step 1 is part of your performance appraisals, if you do performance appraisals or reviews. Because if it's not part of your performance appraisals or reviews, it's not going to be taken very seriously if thought about it at all. So at the end of the day, we need to make sure we're holding people and ourselves accountable. By the way, it doesn't mean we lead with an iron fist and this is a top-down initiative. In fact, not at all. For this process to work, it has to apply to all of us, both leaders and frontline team members. It's the only way it works. So let's jump in a little bit more closely into defining our culture, defining our behaviors, creating clarity, creating expectations, and talk a little bit about why we like behaviors versus values. If you look at the left part of the screen there, this is how most organizations try to define their culture in terms of certain values, things like integrity, quality, respect, innovation. All incredibly important virtues, right? You can't argue that. The challenge is, what do they mean? My guess is if I went around the meeting here today and asked each of you what respect looked like, you probably have different definitions. It might certainly look different if you ask that question of someone who grew up, let's say, in a tough inner city neighborhood versus a rural area. It might also look different based on if someone grew up in another country with an entirely different culture. So values are important, but can mean different things to different people. Whereas behaviors are clear, specific, and street level. Again, these are examples that many of our clients use and behaviors they define as being really important. I already mentioned on our commitments, we do what we say we're going to do. We practice blameless problem solving. Something goes wrong, we don't point fingers. We fix it, diagnose what went wrong, and figure out a way to prevent it from happening again. We have a solutions focus. We're fanatical about response time. We get right back to people all the time, every day. We follow up on everything. We don't leave any stone unturned. We close the loop on all actions. Think about things like this. Think about all of your team members performing behaviors like these or any others that you defined. Being kind, listening generously, but imagine the impact and power and what that does to the organization when we can create that level of clarity and have everyone consistently, living to those behaviors. We call those behaviors, by the way, it's a term we use, fundamentals. We call them fundamentals because we feel they are that fundamental to the success of each individual, both personally and professionally, as well as to the organization. And what we do with our client companies is we help them define the critical behaviors for them. We don't prescribe it. They tell us, we pull it out of them. What are the key core behaviors that if all of your team members were living to every day would just create the level of consistency and clarity and positivity that would take you from where you are today to becoming extraordinary. And we help them develop, what you're looking at here is we help them develop, and I know this will sound kind of corny to some of you, but we help them develop what we call a way card. And it's a little fold out card designed to be kept on person, given to clients and prospects or those we serve, which really clearly outlines who we are and how we do things with a level of clarity that most organizations never come close to. Oh, by the way, this, if you can even read it, I know the font on my computer is way too small, but it gives you a sample. These are our own fundamentals, by the way. These are things that, that we focus on, like doing what's best for the customer, always doing the right thing, so on, so forth. All right, rituals. Again, this is the secret sauce I was talking about. So the way rituals work with our clients is this. What our clients do, oh, by the way, this is just a fun, I think it's some slightly humorous client that brings some of the point about the empty gym parking lot every February. But let me back up a second and talk about the idea of rituals, what they mean. Rituals are things we don't have to set a calendar for or have to force ourselves to remember. They happen automatically. Examples of rituals are brushing our teeth. We don't wake up Sunday morning and say, I'm going to be great this week. In fact, I'm going to be so good, I'm not going to miss a day, and say to ourselves, I'm going to brush my teeth every day, 2 times a day. We don't have to have that conversation with ourselves because it's a ritual. The national anthem, back when we could go to Red Sox games, is a ritual. We don't sit at Fenway Park and wonder if they're going to play the national anthem today. It happens every time. Ritz-Carlton, I'm sure you're all familiar with, always one of the tops in the hospitality industry, have a ritual. That ritual helps make the Ritz-Carlton experience what it is. If any of you have ever been fortunate, if I have one time had the opportunity to stay at one of their properties, it is different. It's certainly different from, most others, but it's a different experience. Large part of the reason how they're able to deliver that experience is based on a ritual that they utilize. What they do, their rituals each day at every property around the world, at every single shift change at each property around the world, before they start their shift, they talk about one customer service centric idea per day. And it might be something as simple as, if a guest asks you where the restroom is, we don't point to it like this gentleman in this picture. Rather, we walk them there. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, that sounds a little creepy. I don't need anybody walking me to the restroom. But that's just the level of service that they deliver. Very quick story. I did an undercover boss test on the Ritz-Carlton a few months ago before COVID hit. I took my daughter down to Washington, D.C. to look at some colleges. And we were staying across the street from a Ritz-Carlton. The Ritz is way out of my budget. But I did a test. Right next to the Ritz-Carlton was the on-property, on-site restaurant. And I knew that going in. But I decided to do a test. So what I did is I walked up to the front desk and I asked the person behind the front desk, excuse me, can you tell me where the where the restaurant is? And sure enough, the person came out from behind the front desk, said to me, I'd be thrilled to show you where it is. Follow me, and literally walked me to the entrance of the restaurant. So they passed the test. as I was leaving the restaurant later that night, I stopped and chatted with the hostess, who was probably in her mid 20s. And I said to her, come on, let's have a conversation. You can be real with me. You're not being recorded in this conversation, but do you really practice those? They call it the daily lineup. So do you really do that daily lineup stuff that I've heard about? And her response was interesting. She said, absolutely. We do it every day before every shift change. And what a great way to start the day was her response. But how powerful is that? Every shift change, every property around the world. With our clients, our rituals work a little bit differently. Our clients focus on one behavior per week, every week. And then they do a series of things to reinforce and coach and teach that behavior with their team members. There's no heavy lifting required. If it did, it wouldn't last. But these are things that just happen every week. Those things include, every week, most of our clients will simply send a message to all team members, usually by email or text or what have you. Just being clear on, this week we're focused on such and such a behavior. Be on the lookout for this, or here's a recent example. Again, it just serves as a kind of a gentle reminder that as an organization, as a company, as a team, we're focused on this behavior this week. What many of our clients also do in addition to that is, if they hold meetings on site, staff meetings, department meetings, meetings of any type, prospect meetings, customer meetings, they always start the meetings with a brief discussion about that week's fundamental as well. Again, it just serves as a reminder to everybody, leads to interesting and deeper conversation about the importance of these behaviors. But it happens every week, at least once a week per meeting. What other clients will do is we have an app. Like all of our good ideas, they come from our clients. Our clients came to us a couple of years ago and said, hey, why don't you guys have an app? Everybody has an app. So we created an app. And what we do with the app is we push content out to our clients pretty much every day. Little 1-minute videos, quick tips, coaching guides for managers and leaders of how to coach on that week's behavior. And this content we push it out every week. Again, just an example of another ritual, with the idea being, you've got all these things happening each and every week to reinforce that fundamental of the week. And we cycle through them one at a time till we get through the list. And then when we get to the end of the list, we start all over again. And then when we get to the end the second time, we start all over again. Or as we like to say, forever. When we roll the process out to employees and team members, we caution them, buckle up and get on for the ride, because this isn't going anywhere. But you can begin to see the level of communication and consistency and predictability. I can tell you, by the way, team members love this process, because think about it. When's the last time you worked someplace that was really this clear about what was expected of them, how we're expected to treat each other, our customers? It rarely happens, but the extraordinary organizations do this, and this is kind of our catchphrase, that good organizations tend to have good cultures by chance. They hire good people, they have good leaders, and things generally work out okay. But world-class organizations or extraordinary cultures have them by design. It takes intention and practice and a process. So in a nutshell, that is our process. That's our framework. Before I jump off the slideshow, stop the share, any questions on any of the slides? Any of you would like to review or have questions on before I stop the share?
Hey, Al, it's Judy.
Hey, Judy.
Quick question.
Sure.
Do you feel that it has to be at the CEO level for the buy-in, or have you worked sort of mid-level departments in that way?
That's a great question, Judy. So I would say this relative to that question. For this process to work, the CEO at a minimum has to support the process. Doesn't mean they need to be the champion of it. If you know the distinction, like you do need someone on hand who's kind of the champion, the kind of the point person, if you will. That doesn't need to be the CEO. But when the rubber hits the road and difficult calls need to be made, yeah, you got to have that accountability of and that really only the executive director, the owner, the CEO, the top person can bring. So it's a great question. An important part of the process for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions? Anything at all? Process or anything? Stacy, can I ask you a question? Just as seeing this for the first time, does the process make sense, the flow of it? I'm always curious as to observations from those kind of, I live in it every day, so having first-time observations is always helpful.
It does. What resonated with me particularly was the follow-up. I'm insane about following up with everybody before I leave at the end of the day, even when I don't have all the answers. So like last night, somebody had emailed me and he was kind of understood what I was looking for, had to do with speaking in the center, had a couple of mix-ups. It was going to be a long email. So I just shot him an email that said, one or two little points, and then I'll get back to you tomorrow in full detail. But just so that he knew that I got it, I was thinking about it, because it's just frustrating when you're waiting on information, or you send out an email, or you make a phone call, and there's no response. It's probably because people are thinking about it, and they have to put together whatever, go find the answers. But you have no idea whether they got the email, it's in junk mail, or they're working on it. So to me, that's just been one of my key things in my consulting practice, in my life, and then here at Salve. It takes more time, of course, but it is kind of what we're known for here. So
yeah, and it's interesting too, Stacy, because what you just described is how we tend to pull those behaviors out. Like when we work with companies, whether big or small, we'll work with certainly their leader. If they have a couple leaders or a leadership team, we'll work with them, and we'll ask them questions like, what are those behaviors, like you've just defined, that separate you? Or what are the behaviors, who are your top people? And what makes them better or different than most of the others? What are those? And usually it comes down to things like that. Oh gosh, Stacy just follows up on everything. Or man, Barbara is just, she's fanatical about responding. Her response times are through the charts. And that's the power of this process, though. You start pulling all of these extraordinary behaviors and defining them and providing clarity, where now we can coach them, we can teach them, we can reinforce them, we can hire for them, right, and manage to them. But yeah, as you just described, that's kind of how the process starts, is defining behaviors just like that.
And finding simple things like that, as you said. And with technology today, it's easy to do. It's just who's thinking about it. And then so even with our students and those interns or whomever worked for me, like, I don't know whether you got my email. So just send me a text or an email that you got it.
Yes.
And I'll hear from you tomorrow. And it kind of just plays down all the way along. So they start doing it and then they look better to their friends, or the teachers will say to me, wow, this person is so different than they were 3 months ago. What did you do? And it's the culture that we set here in the center, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it sounds like you're doing the right things. You're being clear on what's expected, and then making sure it's reinforced over time. It's really that simple. I'm not saying it's easy,
Right.
but it is. It's interesting because with culture, we've often thought, many of us are, well, it's this soft, squishy thing that we can't get our arms around. It's, you know, employee recognition every now and then, or a company picnic, or pizza Friday. And not saying that those things are unimportant, because no, they can be important. But the fact of the matter is you can be systematic about driving the culture you want to. And most folks just never really considered that.
Right. I like
something
what you
you
said
want.
at the beginning too, about when people think about your organization, they immediately think about the worst piece of it. We don't think about that.
No.
But that is so true. That should be emblazoned on your website.
I know, but it's true. And you think some industries that's more obvious than others, like hospitality, for example. You know, we work with a lot of restaurants, and one bad meal, one bad experience can taint that customer's view forever. So,
For sure.
you know, it tends to be a little bit more obvious, but certainly affects all industries. Might not be obvious to the customer, might be more of an internal thing, but it can absolutely affect all organizations. Yeah, and the other part of it is left to chance, and that's, you know, and I'll maybe open this question up to everybody. Without a process, without a an intentional force of any kind, where does culture typically come from? Anyone have thoughts on, think of any organization, where does the culture of that organization typically come from? Kyle, what do you think? Is Kyle still there?
I would say it comes from the top.
Yeah, in part can come from the top. Yep, and as well it should. But where else could it come from? Think of it this way. Like, every group of people has a culture. Every organization has a culture. Every group of people has a culture, right? Your group of friends. Among your groups of friends, which of them really influences the culture of that group? You know, what you can talk about, what you can joke about, you know, the volume level. Which of the members of that group typically drive that?
Extroverted?
Absolutely. It's usually not the quiet, meek ones, right? It's usually the stronger personalities. And if you think of that from an organizational standpoint, that's fine and good as long as your strong personalities are the good ones, right? They live to all the behaviors that you feel are important. But unfortunately, at least in my experience, that's not always the case. You know, in fact, oftentimes it's the cynical one who's always unhappy, it's never enough or never good, right? That has a disproportionate voice amongst everyone else. And that's where, you know, sometimes we have to draw lines, right? Like, all right, how toxic are those folks to our organization? You know, what's the impact they're having? And that's an easy decision to make when they're an underperformer. But what if they're your top salesperson? Or what if they manage your most important client and the client loves them, yet they're toxic to all the other team members? That's where the choices can be really, really difficult to make. But again, it kind of comes down to, how important is this culture stuff? You know, how intentional do we want to be? The great organizations understand that this drives everything they do and want to do everything they can, but about driving the best culture that they possibly can.
And that gets into another day's workshop or seminar roundtable on what do you do with that person.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
as a good leader, do you put them through
Yep.
strengths finders and figure out their strengths and how
Yep.
to work with them? Do you do the empowerment thing? Do you
Absolutely. And
help
we're
them on
all
the
about
road?
that. Yeah, we're all about coaching, trying to bring people up. But there will be situations, right, where regardless of what you do or how much you do, someone in the end just might not be a fit for your organization.
Oh,
And it doesn't,
absolutely.
right? It doesn't make them a bad person. They might just not be a fit for your organization. In fact, in large part, you could be doing them and your organization great service by identifying that, and they could probably be much happier elsewhere. But you're right on any of the 8 steps of the framework, Stacy. There's deep discussion and things you can do. But again, kind of at the core, starting at beginning at the beginning, starts with defining what you want, and then figuring out ways to repeat.
Definitely.
So with that, I'll take any other final questions. If not, I appreciate your time this morning. Hopefully it was helpful and give you at minimum things to think about. But happy to help any of you answer questions. If you wanted to dive deeper on any of these topics or anything at any time, don't hesitate. And thank you again from taking the time. And Kate, I'm thrilled. I was telling Kate before the session started that don't be surprised if you heard a scream upstairs from my teenage daughter doing remote school work because Wi-Fi has been on the fritz. So I'm glad Wi-Fi worked for she and I today.
Yes.
Haven't heard her.
Me too.
Well, thank
Same
you
here
all.
with my kids. Luckily, they're behaving.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I appreciate
Thanks, Al.
it. You
Appreciate
bet.
Al, this
it.
was great. Thank you very much.
Oh, my
Have a great
pleasure.
day, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Al.
you all for coming.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for organizing, Kate.
My pleasure.
You bet.